Yeah, let's see. Let's click this. There you go.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for allowing me to speak English, because if I were going to speak Icelandic, it would be a very short talk indeed. So thank you. And I'll try to speak clearly. I don't know, everyone seems to speak perfect English, but I'll speak as clearly and as carefully as I can. Right, does this work? Trying to click it. Nope.
Well, you can always hit the next button here.
Okay. Okay, while we're sorting this out, I wanted to start by asking everyone 3 questions and ask you if you've got some paper or a notebook just to write down the answers, your own answers. Your most special natural place. Your most special urban place. Places that move you, that you feel comfortable, that you love.
If you hit this one, you get the next slide.
Oh, okay, backwards, yeah. And finally, your most special possession or object. So something that you own, that you feel, you have great attachment to. So just have a think about that and write them down. Hopefully it's quite a simple thing that comes into your head quite quickly. Your most special natural place, your most special urban place, and your most special possession or object. Could be anywhere. It may be Iceland, maybe international. Could be on another planet. Okay. People writing still. Okay. Okay, I'm going to carry on now. The talk's called Combining Professional Skills with Real Lives and Emotions. And I'll give you a little bit of background and then show you a few examples, case studies, and I think then we're going to have a time at the end for some questions and answers. You probably said all that in Icelandic and I didn't understand it. But this is the idea that where we get the best places is where these things come together. You've probably seen other ideas of these sort of interactive circles. I've got lots of them. But I think that this is where we're at really now in terms of planning and placemaking. It's that interaction to ensure that we have balance in what we do. The reason I asked you to write down your special places, your special natural place and urban place and your special object, is that there's been some recent research which I thought was really interesting from the National Trust, which is a charity you might have heard about in the UK, which owns an awful lot of very special buildings and landscape and gardens. And they've undertaken research which shows, and they commissioned a university to carry out neurological and research with people, wiring people's brains up and then showing them pictures and talking to them about their special places and objects. And they found that people actually emotionally are much more connected to places than they are to objects. I mean, we're such a consumerist society and we have so much focus on our objects and we're sold things all the time. But actually, they found in a very recent study that it's places that are so important. And places also that people create their own identity around and want to share with others. So how important is place? It's fundamental to our well-being, to our happiness. Human beings are naturally collaborative and proactive in creating their place. This is barn raising in the States. Often we look back on this and it still happens where when someone wants to build a new home or a barn, an agricultural building, the whole community comes together and they turn it into a festival. So they're helping an individual family to create their own place, their own home, their own working environment. And these are great celebrations. Traditional places have grown up, human beings have built their settlements in organic ways, and they often focus on the space, the environment, but also on economic activity particularly. And these are places we go to when we want to go on holiday or go and visit as tourist places. This is a market town in Yorkshire. And they're built on sound principles of urban design, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail later. And Reykjavík, very structured and following very, very important principles of placemaking in the central areas. Once, sort of through the industrial age, we started to have to plan more and to build quicker to accommodate the expanding populations. People started to think about how to build places. This is Ebenezer Howard, who was the person regarded as the inventor of garden cities, the garden city movement, which was thinking not just about place, but about the community that was going to be created and about sustainable environments, food, well-being, but also about community governance. So places were built, sort of starting with Letchworth, I think it was 1901 or 2, the first garden city, that were really thinking about how to plan new places for the first time. That was in response to the Industrial Revolution and the needs of a growing population and a wealthy population. And we say this is the first community planning weekend, the first collaborative planning event, but this is them on site working collaboratively to plan it, but I'm sure these are all professionals or landowners. This is where I was brought up as a young child, and it's not a garden city, but it's built around garden city principles. It's quite an ordinary place in West London, a suburb, but the houses are fronting onto the street, they have small areas of front garden. They can accommodate the car, but the car doesn't dominate. There's green space, there's walkability, there are shops close by, there are schools, there are all the community facilities that people need. There's a town centre not far away that you can get to by bus. And as a young boy, I was quite happy. But then this started to happen very close to where I lived, and I couldn't quite understand it. I think they didn't look as nice as that then because they were concrete, brutalist architecture. They've been reclad since. But all of the ideas of creating a place seem to have gone. And, as a young boy, I didn't obviously know about all the technical arguments for why that had happened, but there was something happening in the UK and around the world, which was about a new sort of movement of modernism and throwing away really the ideas of good placemaking in favour of something else, which was in part, I suppose, designed around the needs of the car, which was, has become increasingly predominant, and there's quite a lot on how the American model was actually promoted as a car-based model before the war, with great shows in the States run by GM and Ford to promote the use of the car and to sell it. But this, here we are, we got people, this was council, so people were put from living in houses to living in layers of apartments, not very well designed at the ground floor, no connection with the ground floor, no green space, and they've got some balconies, but this is what's around them. And I couldn't, I didn't like it particularly, but people moved in, they were brand new places, but very quickly they became unpopular. And the other thing is the car and designing, putting cars into cities and designing new places around the car, and the impact that actually started to have on communities and we're learning more and more about. And that was the sort of traditional model of placemaking, of designing cities and villages, that you had strong public realm that was very clearly defined, and people lived in blocks, and that's quite an understood, established traditional model. But what was then happening through modernism and the predominance of cars was this movement to buildings in space, and ill-defined space. No one owned it or managed it. It became degraded. People's connections were broken down. The street-based system, the square-based system, was all about how people relate to each other through commerce and social activity. But the new way kind of didn't seem to take that into account. It'll just happen anyway. It's not a problem. We don't have to think about it. But actually, it's led to huge problems. So, what is good placemaking is a critical question for us now. This is a picture from the States in sort of post-war 50s, 60s, and there were these huge urban renewal programs, and they were driving through highways, through established community areas, neighbourhoods, and building a lot of suburbs off the back of that in the outer areas. So you had this white flight from city centres, and the breaking apart of communities and leaving behind people who had no choice. And it led to huge problems, in part, which led to the civil rights movement in the States and people fighting for their rights and for equality and for better conditions. And urban planners started to look at this and take a great deal of notice about what was happening. And there was huge sort of fights between people like Jane Jacobs, who ran campaigns into a local area but was also a nationally known academic, and people like Robert Moses, who was a city planner, who was just driving through all this change, but with no community support for the people who it was going to affect. This is in Scotland, and someone's designed that. That's a place. That's not a factory or a nuclear power plant. It's homes that people are expected to live in, social housing, and look at the environment around it. And that's areas where old houses, terraced houses, have been demolished. So this was very unpopular housing, and it led to, again, in the UK, in this particular case, a lot of problems. Again, it's not just the environmental conditions. There are other issues to do with poverty and injustice, but this is a riot in London in 1985. So politicians started to take a lot of notice. They had to, but also the profession. And I asked you initially, what about your special places? Now, these bad places that we have been designing, and some bad places might think they're good places because they look nice, but they're starting to have huge impacts on our health. And it's not just place, it's about diet, etc. But this sort of move away from active lifestyles and community and sharing and being part of the public realm starts to lead to great health crises. This is in the UK. So we're spending huge amounts of money on preventable diseases, and people are not happy at the same time because they're living in environments that aren't built around their needs. Here's another. This is just taken off the internet recently. And I think I heard a statistic the other day that in the UK now, 25% of children, young people of the age of around 10, are obese. These are children who should be living their lives as children, running around and being fit as a fiddle, but there's something that we're doing to them that's making them unhealthy. The car, important way that people get around. It'll be with us for a long time, no doubt. But does it have to predominate in the way that it does? This is a statistic which is about the preventable deaths in the world, and the car is at the top of the list in the young people's age group. The car kills more people of that age group than anything else. So there seems to be something wrong in the way that we're planning our places now. We're very clever. We've got a lot of technology, a lot of skills. But are we relating to our communities in a way that's getting the places that people that people want and need and love. Going back to the States, 50 years ago, in response to that civil rights movement, the American Institute of Architects were challenged by a black architect at a conference, I think in 1966 or 7. What are you doing to respond to the inequalities in our country? You as a profession are irrelevant, was the charge. So the American Institute of Architects set about creating a program which was called the Regional Urban Design Action Team to bring architects and planners to work in communities, with communities, to start to create plans to change things. This was the first event, RUDAT, Regional Urban Design Assistance Team, which was held in a place called Rapid Falls in the States, where the planners and the architects went and worked with the community over a 3 or 4 day period and started to create this process called a charrette or a RUDAT, and came up with a plan. And that actually was seen as an incredibly successful first attempt. It set waves rippling through the country, and it started a movement which is still going now, which is still run by the American Institute of Architects 50 years later. That had a massive impact in the profession. Actually, it started to create or to give robustness to the urban design profession, that understanding that places, they're not just planned, they have to be designed and curated and thought about on all levels. In the UK and lots of other places, these housing projects particularly that weren't working, I've spent a lot of my career doing that, not actually physically blowing up flats myself, but actually planning, for the destruction of them and designing replacement. That's not sustainable, obviously, to be knocking down things so quickly after they're built. And there was a movement in the UK called the Community Architecture Movement, and Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, was very interested in architecture and how it wasn't responding, or city planning as well, how it wasn't responding to popular demand, what people want and like and need. And so he made that statement, planning and architecture are too important to be left to the professionals. This is in the mid-80s. On that movement was started, and there's Prince Charles with John Thompson. John Thompson is the JT of the JTP practice that I work for. And we started going and working in housing estates that were not functioning well. This was very popular when it was built, but you can see it's not looking great at this stage. This is in around 1984, 85. And initially we were asked to go in and talk to the residents about new kitchens and new bathrooms, but it very quickly became evident that the way to work with a community is to actually get into the community and work with them on a collaborative basis, and soon realised that what they needed was far more fundamental, because the people who could leave were leaving, and it left people behind who had no choice, and then people being moved in who probably weren't going to create that balanced community that people wanted. So we started working with them and came up with a totally different plan, which was far more radical and started to address their needs as a community, not just a new kitchen and a new bathroom, but fundamental things. And there was no money at the time, but they marched on Whitehall on the government, and with this plan, a very proactive plan, but a consensus plan, and managed to get the funding from government to do the work that turned that into that, green spaces, play facilities, community building, and equally important, the perception of the place changed totally. So people, there was remodelling of the flats into maisonettes and two-storey dwellings, and so there was a whole mix and balance in the community. People started to want to stay. People started to want to move in. There was more security. There was more facility. That was quite a well-known project, which led to quite a lot of other things. But at the time, it was quite an ad hoc way of working with the community. It wasn't a sort of structured process. But we were asked to go to a conference in the United States in 1988 called the Remaking Cities Conference, where as well as looking at how to reshape post-industrial cities, and Prince Charles, again, was the chair of that, there was a charrette held, a roudat was held as part of the conference. So for the first time, people from the UK started to see this process that was a structured, managed process to work with communities, large numbers of people, to create new visions for their place. And people then brought that back across the water to Europe, and we started working and creating the community planning process. So, it was very clear, this is a statement, that, professionals were getting it wrong, politicians were getting it wrong. We needed to create the balance and to bring communities more into the planning process. And this is the start of our timeline, our innovation timeline. You've seen the community architecture, but we're moving through into what we call community planning, which is what the book 2020 Visions really is all about, into looking again at what are sustainable places. So the Urban Villages Forum was established to see what made sustainable places. The use of the word village is quite important there. And that was also looking at the economics of place. Moving into working with whole communities, post-industrial communities, to reshape their future in the Urban Renaissance programme. Then going into establishing the Academy of Urbanism, which was trying to break down the silos, the divisions between the professions, working in different silos, bringing everyone together to become urbanists, people who think about the whole city and how to make it an attractive, quality place that meets our needs, rather than just focusing on specific goals. And then moving into placemaking and starting to write prescription for large developments. This is the one on the right, is Battersea Power Station, where we've written the place book. So large commercial developers now are really thinking about quality of place and how to shape the place and curate the place to make it attractive to meet current demand. People want great places. They want to buy into great places, to have experience. And we say that in the case of Battersea, that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So you've got to get it right in cases of these huge developments the first time. And as a company, our model is understanding, engaging, creating. So it's a careful process, but it's bringing and working with communities and stakeholders throughout a process. And again, within those circles, placemaking sits. So we talk about, again, people participating in shaping places, not being consulted, because if you're consulted, you're reacting to something that someone else has already designed. We want people to be involved at the start and to participate, but you need a process for that. And the process there, it's very important, we think, that you involve people in the iterative design process, so that there's an understanding that you don't get it right first time, and if you ask people, then you feedback what you think the answer is, and they say, yes, but that's not quite right. You feedback again, and it takes, this is from the National Charrette Institute in the States, I reckon it takes at least 3 feedback loops to get things right and to build consensus and trust. So that sort of time and the organisation of the process has to involve that element. And what is needed is a well-planned process. So if you're going to take it seriously and involve communities and stakeholders in your planning and placemaking, it needs to be seen that this is a process. You don't have the answer at the beginning, but you're going to take people through that. And we've worked over the last 25 years in a whole range of situations with all sorts of communities on a whole range of projects. In United Arab Emirates, the community there was given a car and a house each by the Crown Prince, and their mortality rate plummeted, and their average life expectancy dropped by 20 years over a 20-year period, because the needs and understanding of that community hadn't been worked into the plan. This is in Indonesia. This is in London. So getting people around the plan, around the table, is critical. So the first ever charrette happened by accident, again in the States, just after the war. This company was designing a school about 2,000 miles from their office, and they were nearly about to be sacked. So to save the project, they thought, let's just move there and try and work it out together with our client. And in the course of a week, they had their office on site, and they developed a plan together with their client, which everyone loved and supported, and it just went easily from then. They started doing it on all their projects and said, well, why didn't we think about that in the first place, that's how we should work? The feedback loops, as I said, is really important in terms of the process and actually designing, sitting around tables in facilitated groups with the community or stakeholders to involve people who don't normally design, but involving them in designing things. You can talk about lots of other things as well, but that's a critical part of the process. I won't go through all these, but there is an organisation called the International Association for Public Participation, IAP2. And I think some of you may have heard of it. I know Sigeborg Hannesdottir, who's not here today, but she's quite active, I think, in the organisation. But they have this list. You can get this online, iap2.org, if you're interested. This is really well thought through, and they review it regularly. This is people who work in public participation, not just in planning and architecture, but in health and education and mining. So it's a really well thought through list there. But it's that thing about taking people seriously, committing to the process, feeding back the results of participation, and telling people also why you may not have been able to do certain things that they wanted. The other thing I think in planning and placemaking is really to understand principles of good placemaking. And, you know, there can be exceptions in different situations, but this is sort of, again, tried and tested in terms of principles of placemaking. And I think we're, you know, getting to this idea of understanding neighbourhood design should be around walkability and connectivity. You know, it's no good just designing places for cars. We can't do that anymore. It leads to lots of bad things and unhappy people in the end. The permeable and the legible block structure, you know, how, again, there are ways to do that, but there's a matrix there. Mixed uses and diversity, you know, people seem to naturally like that sort of thing. We're building that more and more into our places. The quality as well, not just throwing up, and again, we suffer from this in England terribly. Large house builders putting up poor quality, just potato stamp houses, and claiming that people can't afford any more. Well, we don't believe that's the case, but the respect for local heritage and distinctiveness, again, key, and something that comes out of these processes when you work with local people. Sustainable and active transport, I know we've been talking about that today. Environmental sustainability, including green and blue infrastructure. Again, that first slide about the quality of place, the importance of place to our well-being. You know, we can integrate green and blue infrastructure into where we live, and it should be accessible for people, and importantly as well, should be habitats for nature, as well as dealing with water runoff. And the final point, you know, I think any definition of placemaking always talks about the importance of community involvement and stakeholder involvement. And it sort of gives the opening for people to be involved in different ways. Not just, you know, here's some information, this is what we're doing, but actually getting into a dialogue through collaborative planning, placemaking. People start to learn about place, things that they might not have thought of before, thought are important. Suddenly people, their eyes are open and they get much more interested in things and start to realise that with their knowledge, they can start to have quite an impact, and they do have a view on things, and perhaps they could even be involved in deciding what happens and even managing places, or eventually owning and developing for themselves. And again, that's going back to how communities were first created. So I'm going to show you a few case studies. Okay. What have we got, 25 minutes to go? Yeah. So I'll try and whip through quite quickly, but just try and draw out key lessons from each one, really. This was an old army barracks in South London called Caterham Barracks. And at the time, the community had very negative experience of development because it was the sort of housing I talked about that brought nothing other than some houses and more traffic. And so the council asked them in a probably not a very good consultation process what they wanted, and they said nothing. We want to keep the open spaces, we want them to be sports facilities. You can build 12 houses over in the right-hand corner, but we don't want anything. Because this wasn't viable, but it was sold to a developer on the basis of a brief that had 60 homes, some converted barracks, and some employment uses, and a lot of open space, and nothing much more. So the developer bought it for £11 million. But there was a huge history to the site, but the local area, the army had left, and the local economy was suffering. People said, well, you're inviting us to come and be part of deciding what happens, but why should we decide what happens? We're not probably going to live there. So we said, well, someone's got to be the guardians for the community who come and make the decisions, from a community point of view and agree what we can do there. So we said the guards move out and the guardians move in. And we sat down with people, and we had a very big turnout. People were really interested in the site. Many of them had been there, but they hadn't been able to go there subsequently. And over 2 days of public workshops, this lady was the caterer. She was making the sandwiches. But when we started talking about the housing in this group, the housing officer from the council said, well, this lady's lived here all her life. She's a grandmother. She's brought up her children and now her grandchildren. She should be involved. And she sat down and they started drawing this idea of an urban village or a village community, which kept the key green spaces, the heritage, but very importantly, you can see a heart in the middle. And people sort of always tend to end up drawing a heart in their if they're designing a new place. Where can we meet as a community? What's our sort of natural coming together place? And she then reported that back to everybody at the end of that session. So in the 2 days of just working with the community and talking to them about all the issues, we went from a plan that was basically 60 homes to one that was 360, based on streets and squares and green spaces and heritage, and providing the sort of range of things, businesses, opportunities, social amenities that people wanted and recognised would be part of a village community. This was reported back on day 5. So part of the process is to draw up the community's view that's worked through with the professionals and turn it on to the next level, report it back and go through it and walk people through. So everyone said, yeah, that's the sort of thing we were talking about. So what happens next? Well, we held around 50 meetings over the next few months to start to talk about the different issues in relation to creating the plan and to actually getting it delivered. And of course, the developer was involved in all of this. And so eventually, after a year, the council changed their policy because there was so much community support for this new plan. And this was voted through and over the coming years was developed. And that's the completed scheme. And a core part of its success, as well as the quality generally behind it, but is this mix of uses, which gives it that village feel. And the critical mass of more people, both from inside the village, but also it's very well connected to outside, so people don't feel it's an exclusive place, but everyone can use it. And importantly also, the community were involved in managing some of the assets, so a community trust was set up, and they now manage this community centre, the creche, which is very vibrant. There's a medical centre and a swimming pool on site. People said we want a bus down to the station, which we can't get to at the moment, so this is now subsidised through the development, people paying money into their management charge to the Community Development Trust, which is then helps to subsidise and make this bus a viable operation. So people said that they loved being part of that process and the fact they live here and the fact that they were able to decide, really help decide what happened has made such a big difference. So this huge amount of added value, in this case, Won't happen everywhere in this way, but through working with the community, everyone benefited. The developer benefited, but assets were given to the community, and this place was created, which is very popular and sells at much higher rates than the surrounding area, but it includes affordable housing as well. The next case study is this is in the book as well. This is Santa Fe, again where a community was the old railway yard. The council just started to develop a plan for the old railway yard without including the community, and it was in a very important part of the community. This is an old historic photo. And they called in the American Institute of Architects. They rejected the plan, and in the end, the council bought the land. And there was a change of mayor who supported that concept, and a rudat, a charrette, was held. And again, over a few days, the community came up with this completely different plan, which was about, yes, housing, employment, opportunities, but also creating this wonderful park, having a farmer's market, bringing the railway line back, and creating a whole new mixed-use area in the heart of their community. They have a town centre. They're very much a tourist destination, so their town square was taken over by tourism, which they kind of didn't mind, but they just wanted a place for themselves. So now this place, 20 years on, following that process, which they still look back on, and was very carefully managed, created this mixed-use, vibrant place which supports local businesses, local economy, and in the parkland, which they ran an international competition to design, they now have 90, the last count last year, they had over 90 different events through the year. So again, the community is so invested in this project because they've been in from the start. People listened to what they said. They understood the local culture, the local heritage, and made something for the community. In Scarborough, we worked at the level of a whole town, which was one of the very early seaside resorts in the UK. But because people started going to Spain for their holidays to the sun, and now to Iceland, the town itself lost its kind of main economic driver. So we were asked to work with the community again, and we had over 1,000 people in 2 days. We did a lot of work in the run-up to that event. But people drew out this vision which recognized the different levels of activity and interest within the community and within the town. It's not just one thing, it's not just a tourism town, used to be. It's not just a failing town now. It's a town that has all sorts of different aspects which different people have different levels of interest in. So the idea that it's a cultural town, a heritage town, a conference town, a tourism town, a living town, a healthy town. So we worked through these points with the community. A 360-degree town, how do you get people from the coast into the town itself? Because coastal towns, as you know, have kind of half a catchment. An investment town, business, so important. So people hearing this and talking and thinking about their town in a completely new way, and actually seeing the opportunities rather than the decline, and setting up a town team. So yes, there's a council, yes, there's a regional development agency, but there's also a group of community people who don't have to be voted for or do a lot, but they can come and be part of something that they think is important to them, with no real restrictions. The only thing was you leave politics at the door in this case, and you talk about what is best for the town over the next 25 years. And there's a structure, so people start going off and doing things. The town team were able to sign off funding coming in from the regional development agency, so the RDA, the town council, and the town team were the three signatories to any funding coming in. A charter was created which talked about the future and what the town needed, a vision document. And the vision was drawn up over the community planning weekend and delivered over the next few years in the way that that the community thought was important. And now, even today, this is a recent project. This has been going on for 15 years, but this wouldn't have happened, so I'm told by the local people, if that whole process of getting the community together hadn't happened in the first place. So this is a university technical college, which was basically, people now feel in Scarborough that they can just ring around everyone and make things happen because there's a whole new network formed. And it's been recognised and won lots of awards, including the International Association for Public Participation Grand Jury First Prize. There's a charrette for a tornado and the recovery, where people realised it wasn't actually a physical thing. The physical design of the place was pretty good. The destroyed buildings would be rebuilt. But what needed to be invested in was the community and also the local facilities and the walkability of the community. This has now, since that point, become, again, one of the most flourishing parts of East Nashville. And people, again, look back to that moment where they all came together in a facilitated event. This is a historic context in York, which was an old Roman city. This is the last site within the walls on the right-hand side there. And again, people were desperately frightened about what might happen. But through a community planning process and working with people, looking at the quality of the architecture, the shape of the city, we developed a plan that reflected the shape of the city. It wasn't copying, it wasn't pastiche, but it was about the fine-grained nature of the city. And this, again, has now been built. Dockland sites, again, talking to people about the future of their industry and getting them to say the things that are important, which is shipbuilding will never come back. We need to move into a new future and create something special, but which respects the history and the heritage of the area. St Clement's, again, we've heard about housing and how it's becoming unaffordable across the board in Europe. I think America has the same problems. We certainly do in London and the cities, major cities in London. So this is an attempt through what's called a community land trust to involve people in developing their own affordable housing, which creates housing at a fraction of the market value. And again, through this process of really understanding the community and drawing them into the design process and talking about what's important. And before the development of the site itself, creating meanwhile uses to bring people back into a site that's been out of use for 10 years and start to use it again. This is a film festival that was curated by Danny Boyle, the Oscar-winning film director, as a meanwhile use, getting people active. And the company, the social enterprise that organised all this is now something that's still running. So it formed something that still has an impact in the local area, but it's now been developed. This is in Winchester, another historic city, where there was a lot of controversy and marching to prevent the plans that the city had drawn up. And again, through a careful process working with the city council, we were asked to draw up a supplementary planning document for a key area in the city centre. And again, through this process of initially launching the project, having events in the far district as well, because they use the city, but we were going out to market towns. Advertising, having clear promotion, explain to people what was going to happen. Holding an event, we had 700 people on the first day, but they're sitting down and being properly engaged and having a proper input into what's going to happen and being listened to. A lot of importance on culture, on the heritage of the place, on the fine-grained nature of the city. Young people, hands-on planning, starting to draw up these ideas and then creating this vision, these key themes that, again, are not just about the physical, but they're about all aspects of life within the city and the importance, again, of continuing the community participation at the end. We then created the document and continued to consult on it in a very meticulous way until eventually it was adopted earlier this year. This was a project that was fraught with difficulty from the start, but again, just through treating people as adults and as part of the community in a respectful way, and we developed a lot of trust. We started using the vocabulary that came out of the event, such as people wanted Winchesterness, and they wanted it to be developed in a step-by-step way. Working at a regional planning level, this is in Wick and Thurso, which I noticed on the marine strategy drawing up in the north of Scotland here, working with people through a community planning process to be the first stage of a new local development plan. Again, a historic environment, but getting people thinking about their town and developing a whole town strategy that reacts to the needs of the new economy, moving from a nuclear economy into a sustainable energy economy. We're now working a lot on garden villages, which is the government policy to bring all of these aspects into designing new settlements. And the key thing, again, is addressing through these strategies, working through community planning, to develop principles and strategies at a whole range of levels for these new communities, going into community governance, going into enterprise, going into the environment, the walkability. And these are set up as part of the planning process, so it's all very, very open. People can see and debate and dialogue on all of these things to what it is to create a new community in this case. And the thing here about the walkability, so in this new community, which will be about 4,000 people, 1,000 homes and 1,000 jobs, no one will be more than a 10-minute walk from the centre. So it'll be a walkable, sustainable community. Not to say people won't go out elsewhere and work in other places and shop in other places, but the needs of the community are met on their doorstep. The idea of bringing back the old traditional high street, small local businesses, mixing the enterprise zone with the residential zone, allowing people to work from home and to build home offices, creating character areas in the neighbourhoods. This won't be built in one go, so the idea that the different development parcels will be built, they'll have their own character, but they'll all be integrated and linked to areas of green. The importance of employment, the different scales, bringing the horses through in this case, the landscape through and integrated into the scheme, and also linking to the wider countryside and giving people, this is called a SANG, which is a sustainable area of natural green space that people can go to and protects more environmentally sensitive areas. Sorry, that's there, shouldn't be there. Lubeck, where the community, that they had the money, the council had the money, the business community had the money to rebuild the public spaces in this World Heritage Site, but they couldn't agree themselves. So why don't we ask the community and get them involved? And over a weekend, the strategy was agreed in 5 days, and they've just built it out. So will it work in Iceland? We hope so. We've been doing a few in the past, and this is Urdaholt, where young people there were involved in shaping the initial vision. And again, this integration, thinking about all the elements of town and placemaking, designing an initial concept, integrating important elements in terms of the environmental strategy, designing the vision, and then seeing it built out. So I've got lessons in my book there. I'll let you read them when you get the book, but you've probably seen some of them. I've tried to draw out some of the key lessons. I think one of the things I just saw was about political leadership and buy-in into these processes. It's a great way to bring people together and to shape places in an organised way and an established methodology, but it has to be done with leadership and with interest in the outcomes and delivering the outcomes, bringing people with you. So sustainable development is best achieved if the knowledge and commitment of local communities is engaged at every stage of the process. That's our clear view as a company. Voting is great, democracy is great, but it's not enough, clearly, from what we saw at the beginning of the presentation, necessarily to get the places. There needs to be a balance between professional and political and community involvement. So thank you very much. This is back to the questions, and I think if you think about how important places are to us all, I think the research, I think it's really important that we emotionally respond to great places. Why is it that we create so many ordinary places that we inhabit for most of our lives? There are some wonderful parts of town, wonderful parts of Reykjavík, but there are some places perhaps that don't quite live up to that, and there are new places that we're building that are still very car-dominated. How is it that we can get, we all experience this importance of place, both the natural environment but the built environment. How do we get that importance into our planning processes? And I would argue that it's through working with communities and bringing in the wisdom and knowledge and creativity of communities that we keep our professional work up to the most exemplary that it can be. Sorry, there should be something that says thank you, but it's not there. Thank you very much.